Welcome back to the Present History podcast. This episode is the recording of the talk I gave at Chalk History Festival this year. Just as a quick warning, there are a few loud bangs here and there. That's the joy of being at a history festival. You get World War II soldiers driving around in tanks and shooting guns while you're giving a talk about King Arthur. And we wouldn't have it any other way. So sit back and enjoy my talk from Chalk History Festival 2024. Well, good morning. Good morning. You can all hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming. It's so nice to see so many of you here. It's always nice to talk to a crowd rather than empty chairs, so I do really appreciate that. I want to start with a question. How do you build a culture? One of the main ways humans have built cultures and civilizations throughout history is through the stories we tell. I mean, it makes sense, right? Humans are enstoried people. Our lives are our own stories. Our world is a cosmos of narrative. I mean, what is history if not the gathering, penning, and retelling of all the stories of all the people and events that have lived and happened in the past? We tell the stories of empires and civilizations, heroes and villains, empires and conquests, beasts and angels, life and death. And humans have always told stories, not only to entertain, but to form and mold behavior, morality, and even identity. Children are raised on stories, and whether conscious or not, they inevitably mold themselves on the example they see in the heroes or even sometimes the villains of the stories they listen to. Stories have an almost unrivaled way in which they can capture, grow, and set alight the imaginations of individuals and nations. Governments have united nations around stories. Kings and warriors have gone to war to try and emulate the stories of their gods and their heroes from their epics. So often, the process of enculturation happens through the stories that we tell. And what stories do is they enable grand themes, moral codes, virtues, goals, ambitions, desires to be so imaginatively illustrated and embodied that they are much easier to remember. I mean, let's think about this. It's much easier to tell someone, be like Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, than it is to say, be strong but kind, be a good leader, be wise yet active, be a good friend. Or King Alfred the Great. He epitomizes everything it means to be English. Follow after him. Rather than saying, stand for your nation, protect it from invaders, establish education and social structure. Stories are ambitions made manifest, morality embodied, values and virtues illustrated. There's also something deep within us that resonates with stories. An American author, N.D. Wilson, once wrote that stories are soul food. They resonate with something deep in our identity. They bring out something in us that we want to be like the people we hear about. We want to be like the stories we tell. And this is happening nationally too. Every nation, and this is particularly evident in the ancient and early modern world, every nation has their foundation myth. They have their origin story of where they came from. And so many of the values and ideas that feed that culture and that society and that nation can be found in those stories. What it means to be English, American, Indian, Greek can be uncovered, layered deep within their origin stories. And this continues in the stories that we tell ourselves today. Every nation has their national heroes. George Washington, Robert the Bruce, King David, Mahatma Gandhi, the Red Baron, and the like. I had to be careful about the German one that I chose. These heroes become icons and examples for a nation of people to try to emulate, and for a nation's leaders to encourage their people and country to follow after. We can see this incredibly clearly in the history of medieval Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in 1136, created a history of Britain that could be used to trace the lineage of his king, Stephen, all the way back to Brutus, the heir of the Trojans. This story was used to present the king as intimately connected to the heirs of the heroes of antiquity, drawing a straight line from the present to the myths and legends of the highly respected, highly educated, sophisticated and beloved ancient Greek world. So Geoffrey of Monmouth uses his story to do that, but he also uses it to present Britain not only as a nation that is worthy to be named alongside Greece and Rome, but also just plainly as the best nation of all. This is how he starts his very first chapter. Britain, the best of islands, is situated in the Western Ocean. He was not one for subtlety. And this was not uncommon in the medieval period, with stories, histories, and myths being written to connect the present with a past they wanted, to present themselves as the true heirs of this lineage and as a nation worthy of this heritage. Geoffrey also included and brought to life as history the story of King Arthur. Now, whatever you believe about King Arthur, whether he was real or not, pure myth or not, it didn't matter to Geoffrey. He included Arthur as history, and he had it all. He was the heir of the Romans, the last vestige of all the goodness, the civility, and the power of the Roman Empire. Geoffrey wrote this of Arthur. Arthur was a youth of such unparalleled courage and generosity, joined with that sweetness of temper and innate goodness, as gained him universal love. Arthur resolved to make use of his courage and to fall upon the Saxons. To this he was also moved by the justice of his cause, since the entire monarchy of Britain belonged to him by hereditary right. What are we seeing here? We're seeing the archetype of courage, kindness, generosity, goodness, justice, power, respect, and duty. I mean, Geoffrey isn't very subtle about it, but we can see how much admirable virtue is communicated in such a small paragraph. This is the power of story. And this was to continue through the medieval period and into the early modern period, with King Arthur gaining a distinct place in the identity and national folklore of Britain. One example of this I personally really love is the round table in the Great Hall in Winchester. Now, if you look at that round table, supposedly it's the round table of King Arthur. And if you look at the king in the middle of that table, you might recognize him, but not as King Arthur, but as Henry VIII, because Henry VIII had it specially painted for himself so that he was able to claim direct lineage from King Arthur as the King of Britain. This shows just how deeply ingrained the story of King Arthur was in British culture. Everything Arthur was and represented, Henry wanted to be recognized for. Our cultural identity was built on the figure of Arthur, in all his courage, kindness, generosity, goodness, justice, power, respect, and duty. Now, alongside the story of Arthur also rose the story of St. George and the dragon. Most of you will know this story, but there was a town being harassed by a dragon, and to appease him, they would feed the dragon their sheep as a sacrifice, just to make him go away. But soon enough, they ran out of sheep. So the next logical thing to do was start sacrificing your children. So they were feeding their children to this dragon, and they started a lottery system to figure out who was going to be called on next. And eventually, the name of the king's daughter was called upon to be sacrificed to the dragon. And it just so happened that St. George was passing by, a legendary Roman soldier from the legions, potentially a member of Roman aristocracy. The sources, the early stories, differ. But as he was coming past, he saw the plight of the town and of the king and decided to put an end to this foul beast. Now here is where the early stories diverge. Some of them say that he slew the dragon in combat, killed him right there and then. Others say that he defeated him, put a rope around his neck, took him before the king so that he could be recognized as the savior of the town. And once he was recognized, and the king had given him his reward, he killed the dragon right there in the court of the king. Again, we see a similar thing to that which we saw in Arthur. Virtue embodied in a legendary hero. Courage, honor, chivalry, justice, power, and strength. Throw in some distinctly Christian homages to the fight against child sacrifice by the people of God in the wilderness of Exodus, and to the images of a Christian warrior hero putting faith into action. And you have a story that will resonate with a nation and form a significant part of a nation's cultural identity. I mean, we still celebrate it today. We still celebrate St. George's Day, and our flag is the St. George's Cross. Our cultural identity was forged in the stories of George, in all his courage, honor, Christian virtue, goodness, justice, power, chivalry, and duty. And from the medieval period to the modern, this only increased. These cultural symbols and heroes became more and more entrenched. And they came to symbolize a bygone Britain that was not only in our heritage, but also in our aspirations. We yearned for a world that existed in these myths. We had a kind of mythologized nostalgia. We longed for heroes that might not have actually existed. I mean, in the same way that today we might long for an England football team that was world beaters and good at the sport. We were the nation of St. George and King Arthur. But we could also be a nation of St. George's and King Arthur's. As Hayley Claxton, a historian, wrote in her piece, The Knights of the Front. In the centuries between the Middle Ages and the start of the First World War in 1914, stories of knights, chivalric codes, and other forms of medieval history were well recognized and formed a prism through which the contemporaries viewed the present. And then, in 1914, the world began to change. A war began that would shift how culture, society, warfare, and politics was done. This was the first truly total war in history. Every facet of society was mobilized. The factories, the music, the cinemas, the politics, the churches, everything became captured and geared towards the war effort. It was unprecedented, and it changed the face of Britain forever. And it's important to remember that before the war broke out, Britain was in turmoil. Rather ironically, the announcement of the war gave the country a chance to take a breather, to unify around a common cause again. The workers had been striking. The women were getting increasingly violent in their fight for enfranchisement, and the Irish were on the verge of a civil war. All three, individually, played crucial roles in shaking the foundations of the British state, and in tandem were an incredibly difficult storm for Britain to weather. Any beauty that the old stories of Britain held was overshadowed and silenced by the turmoil and upheaval of the early 20th century. It took the war to reunify the nation and re-establish the cultural centrality of these myths and legends. We had a collective enemy that we could fight together as one. This sounds familiar. King Arthur had his Anglo-Saxon hordes. St. George had his dragon. And we now had our great enemy, the Central Powers. We as a nation could now fight like the heroes of old. We could go to war as they did, exhibiting all the courage, honour, virtue, goodness, justice, power, chivalry, and duty that they had. And this actually started very early in the war effort. As soon as Belgium was invaded and destroyed, the medievalist rhetoric began. It was incredibly easy to translate the story of St. George into their present day. Belgium, the princess, was being attacked and potentially devoured by the great German dragon. And we, the Brits, we could sweep in as St. George, slay this dragon and save the princess. Finally, the modern British man had the opportunity to fight as the mythological heroes. He could stand alongside George and Arthur. He could be quintessentially, mythologically British. It also allowed for a renewed synthesis in being chivalric and gentlemanly, and being a warrior hero. As Alan Franson wrote in his book, Bloody Good, Chivalry, Sacrifice in the Great War, it was the work of medieval chivalry to turn the warrior into a gentleman. And it was the work of World War I to turn the gentlemen of the 19th century into warriors. Chivalry worked as well for the second purpose as for the first. Expanding on this, here's Haley Claxon again. Visual representations of the armoured knight setting off to defend the weak, uphold the king's honour and find glory in combat, supplied a vigorous model for the modern soldier, and encouraged men to see these ambitions as reasons to sign up and join the war effort. These three goals, to defend defenceless women and children at home, to maintain national pride, and to gain personal prestige, were the socially voiced war aims sought by most of the individuals who voluntarily joined the military during the Great War. The opportunity for some really effective propaganda and recruitment material was not missed by the government, and they found themselves in a unique position among the warring powers. They were neither invaded or possessed a system of conscription until 1916. So the British public had to be persuaded to participate in the total war effort. They knew they had to mobilise culture. The great myths and stories of old had to be marched out into the field. Herbert Asquith, Prime Minister, a month into the war, gave a great speech about the plight of Belgium and the duty of Britain, saying, "We shall not sheathe our sword until Belgium recovers all, and more than all she has sacrificed." This was also immediately reflected visually too. There are incredible posters showing St. George fighting the dragon, St. George on a white horse symbolising purity and goodness, fighting this dark green dragon. I mean, it's really striking when you look at it. And the words above and below, it says, "People of Britain, we need you now." What this poster is doing is showing you St. George and then saying you can be him. You can stand in the place of St. George, fight the dragon and deliver victory. Not only for yourself or even just for the victim, but also for your country. Patriotic pride was indelibly inked on the medieval propaganda of the time. Not only were the individual soldiers and recruits St. George's, but the nation itself was a collective St. George. We could go to war to emulate everything we believed ourselves to be innately, and everything we wished ourselves to be presently. Indeed, Reverend G.D. Rosenthal, writing in the Church Times on the 21st of December 1917, put it incredibly clearly. St. George is once more struggling in Syria with the dragon, glutted with the blood of his Armenian victims. Our armies in France, as in Palestine, are on pilgrimage. They are fighting for the cross. They are engaged in the same holy war in which Richard Coeur de Lion and his crusaders pitted themselves against the Saracens in days of yore. For all of which Jerusalem is the symbol, for truth, for honor, for justice, for righteousness, for freedom. These are the things for which England is giving her all today. This framed the war as another incident of classic British heroes doing classically British heroic things. They were fighting with Christian virtue, courage, honor, goodness, justice, power, chivalry, and duty. It was completely in step with the cultural image that we had of ourselves. It placed us alongside our heroes as their heirs and equals. And the weaponization of medieval myth and legend worked obscenely well. Chris Baker, in his book The Long, Long Trail, The British Army in the Great War, said, "The use of propaganda in World War I had a profound impact on the conflict. This was one of the forces that encouraged the rapid growth of the British Army, which recruited a total of 4,006,158 men from England alone, not including English colonies, between 1914 and 1918. And looking back on the war, on St. George's Day, 1918, a correspondent in the Times wrote about the strain of St. George on British history and identity, saying, "Nor did the strain fail when the war broke upon the world. The youth of this land would never have taken the sword as they'd if it had not been for them a crusade. They saw a dragon across the path, and they had to go. They, in the memory of the world, will be held with the hosts of Christian chivalry." This shows just how deep the story, myths, and legends were embedded in British cultural identity and our perception of the war at the time. So if it is so deeply ingrained within us, the question naturally arises, where has it gone? Why do we not have the same sense of connectedness with the medieval Britain that the early modern Britons seemed to? Well, there are many answers to this, and maybe they can be brought out in discussion later, but one of the main reasons was that as the war ended and the true extent, destruction, and catastrophe was seen, the human toll was experienced, and the national effects felt, disillusionment began to set in. I don't know whether I could ever put it better than Claxton, as she writes. By the end of the war, these ideals had been shattered. War was not a glorious spectacle with glittering swords and shining armor, in which dragons were slain and damsels in distress were saved. Instead, it was hell on earth. This realization would forever leave an impact on those who had lived through the Great War. In their retelling of war, battle would no longer be an epic folk history of chivalry. Instead, many survivors told the opposite story. This is the other side of the cultural identity coin. However high you build up your cultural identity on stories, myths, legends, heroes, and chivalry, will be how far they fall when they are revealed to be empty, false, or unattainable. As soon as the promise of glory fails, as soon as the hero is revealed to be less than perfect, as soon as the promises of mythology start to break down, cracks can start to emerge in the collective identity. The First World War was revealed to have been a hellish horror show of death, destruction, and loss. All the medieval propaganda was forced to yield to this reality. And that's why our perception of the First World War is what it is today. Futile, pointless, unnecessary. I have an issue with that characterization, but that is the collective idea. Partly because of the true human cost and political impact, but also because it didn't match up to the myths, the rhetoric, and the stories that it had been shrouded in. And yet our culture is still built on stories today. We still have our heroes, villains, and legends. Some may hold George and Arthur closer than others might, but we all have our myths and tales. So let me finish with a question to all of you. What stories are you listening to, believing, and telling? Who are your heroes and villains? And to echo the question that I started with, how do you build your culture? Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Present History podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe, leave a review if you're feeling positive, and we'll see you in the next one.